At its peak, 11,000 workers in Lancashire built the lorries and tanks that carried Britain through 2 world wars. The Octopus, the Beaver, the Comet, household names of British Haulage, exported to 50 countries from a town that kept Leyland time. Then, the government sold the truck division to a Dutch company half its size. When DAF went bankrupt in 1993, the Dutch government rescued Eindhoven within a month. Heseltine told the Commons he had not participated in the discussions. Today, the trucks rolling off the surviving line carry a Dutch badge, not a British one. Not one catastrophe. 2 decisions in 2 capitals, one that acted, and one that walked away. Chapter 1. The Blacksmith Who Didn't Want to Shoe Horses. The story begins in a smithy on Water Street, in a Lancashire village so small that its entire population in 1901 would fit inside a modern football ground. Leyland sat on the London and North Western Railway's main line between London and Glasgow. A halfway marker stone stood just outside the village. But in the early 1890s, it was still a place of horse traffic, bad roads, and the steady rhythms of King Cotton. Textile mills employed the majority of local labour across the county. The Leyland and Birmingham Rubber Company had a works in the village itself. Nobody was building motor vehicles. Nobody, that is, except James Sumner. Sumner was born in 1860, the son of a blacksmith, and he'd inherited his father's shop. But he didn't want to shoe horses. He wanted to build steam engines. He'd already entered a steam-powered lawnmower into the Royal Lancashire Agricultural Show and taken first prize and a silver medal, and here's a detail worth holding on to. Dr. W.G. Grace, the most famous cricketer in England, would later buy one of Sumner's lawnmowers for the Oval. The blacksmith's son of Leyland once mowed the wicket where Grace played. Sumner's tinkering had produced a 3-wheeled steam car driven by a lawnmower engine. A Preston firm, Coulthard and Company, had bought a half share in his small business, J. Sumner Limited. But the real momentum arrived in 1895, in the person of Henry Spurrier II. Henry Spurrier II was 36 years old, the son of a wealthy oil merchant and engineer with American railroad experience. The elder Spurrier had died young. But his son had spent the better part of a decade in America. An apprenticeship with Collier and Company of Salford, 3 years' work in the United States, a brief venture at his own engineering shop in Tutbury, Staffordshire, then back across the Atlantic as a draughtsman with the Florida Central and Peninsula Railroad. He came home to England in 1895 with American manners, an American wife named Jessie Albro, and a sharp grasp of mechanical detail that colleagues would remember for the rest of their lives. His brother George Stretton Spurrier provided further family capital. Coulthard's share passed to George. Henry II took a partnership with Sumner. And on the 1st of June 1896, the Lancashire Steam Motor Company was incorporated. Premises were rented in Herbert Street, Leyland. The workforce numbered 20. Henry II described himself as a steam engine maker. Sumner described himself as a blacksmith. His brother-in-law William joined the bench. Within months they'd produced a 1.5-ton oil-fired steam van with a vertical fire tube boiler and a 2-cylinder compound engine. They were building in the gap between the horse and the locomotive, vehicles heavier than horses, lighter than railway engines, ready for the bad roads of Industrial Revolution Lancashire. And they were about to prove it. In June 1897, Henry II, William Sumner, and a young engineer named Ted Hamer drove their steam van to the Royal Agricultural Society of England trials at Manchester. They took the silver medal, the top prize for self-propelled vehicles. The following year at Birmingham, they took first prize and £100. The Lancashire Steam Motor Company, barely 2 years old, had made its name in the trade press. What followed was quiet, steady growth. The first export order, a steam-powered mail van sent to Ceylon, became the earliest Leyland on foreign soil. The first Leyland bus, a steam vehicle, went to the Dundee Motor Omnibus Company in 1900. By 1902, the workforce had passed 150, and the firm had moved to larger premises on Hove Lane, the site that would remain the spiritual heart of Leyland Motors for the next 9 decades. The first petrol vehicle, nicknamed the Pig, appeared in 1904. The X-Type 3.5-tonner of 1907 was the firm's first wholly in-house petrol design. In April 1907, the company absorbed Coulthard's of Preston, the steam wagon competitor, and adopted a cleaner name, Leyland Motors Limited. The Lancashire Steam Motor Company was no more. Henry Spurrier the Elder had died in 1898. Henry II was now the dominant personality, described by colleagues as tireless, sharp-tongued, and obsessed with cost control. He named his board directors rather than partners and insisted on bookkeeping in the American style. Stories survived of his digestive ulcers and his preference for plain food at the works canteen. As for James Sumner, the blacksmith who started it all, he retired before the First World War and quietly disappeared from the company history. He died in 1924. The firm he'd co-founded would outlive him by nearly 70 years as an independent name and by more than a century as a working factory. But by the time the last lorry badge carried the word Leyland, nobody outside the village remembered the man who'd rather build steam engines than shoe horses. Chapter 2. The Lorry That Won the War. In 1912, the British War Office, contemplating the next European war, devised a scheme that would transform Leyland's fortunes overnight. The plan was simple and ruthless: subsidise commercial vehicle operators who bought military-grade lorries, £50 cash, £20 a year for 3 years, then reserve the right to buy back every vehicle at 72 hours' notice when war came, at market value plus 25%. Trials were held at Aldershot. Vehicles were arranged in 2 weight classes. Of all British manufacturers, only Leyland was certified in both. The subsidy A-Type 3-tonner, soon universally known as the RAF type, was born. The War Office's first order was for 88 chassis, priced at £780 each, of which 110 was the government grant. With orders flooding in, Leyland bought 25 acres of land at Farrington, just north of the village, and laid out a new factory complex. John Godfrey Parry Thomas, a Welsh engineer who would later become a household name as a Brooklyn speed record driver, was appointed chief designer. By August 1914, Leyland employed around 1,500 people and had produced approximately 1,275 petrol lorries and 415 steam wagons. Then, civilian production stopped. From 1915 onward, Leyland's entire output went to the British forces. By the armistice, the company had built 5,932 vehicles, of which 4,721 would be operated by the Royal Flying Corps and, from April 1918, the new Royal Air Force. The RAF type became the standard British Empire workshop, fuel and balloon truck of the Western Front. Leyland's workforce trebled to 3,000. The company acquired a steel works with its own power station and opened Northworks, Southworks, the Farrington plant, and a small factory at Chorley, and somewhere in the works during his school holidays from Repton. A teenager was mucking about with vehicles on the shop floor. Henry Spurrier III, grandson of the co-founder, son of Henry II, had been born in Leyland on the 16th of June, 1898. In 1916, he left to fly with the Royal Flying Corps in Mesopotamia, India, and the Middle East. He contracted both typhoid and dysentery. For the rest of his life, he'd be chronically dyspeptic, surviving, as one biographer put it, much of his life on scrambled eggs. The boy would return. But first, his father nearly destroyed the company. Henry II made 2 catastrophic decisions in quick succession. With the armistice, the British government announced it would auction off its 66,000-vehicle military fleet. Henry II saw what this meant. A flood of cheap surplus lorries would destroy Leyland's new truck market and tarnish the Leyland name. His answer was to buy them all back. Leyland purchased over 3,000 ex-War Department chassis and acquired the former Sopwith aircraft factory at Ham, near Kingston upon Thames, to recondition them. The reconditioning was done at a loss. Simultaneously, Parry Thomas was given free rein to design the Leyland 8, a luxury car intended to rival Rolls-Royce, priced at £7,000, of which somewhere between 8 and 18 were ever built, depending on the source. Combined with a brutal slump in 1921-22, Leyland's £1 ordinary shares fell to 1 shilling and 9 pence. Henry II compounded matters by inviting onto the board 2 men who turned out to be a bankrupt and a swindler. The company nearly went under. Bus orders alone kept it alive between 1922 and 1924. But Henry III came home. He worked under Parry Thomas and his assistant Reed Railton, became assistant general manager in 1925, and assumed responsibility for overseas sales in 1930, where he proved a brilliant exporter. In the late 1920s, the company invented what the industry would call the Leyland Zoo. Every model carried an animal name. The lion, the tiger, the Titan, George John Rackham's revolutionary low-floor double-decker, designed by a man who'd trained at Yellow Coach in Chicago, the lioness, llama, leveret, terrier, badger, beaver, bull, bison, buffalo, the heavy truck range, the hippo, the rhino, and in 1934, the octopus, the legendary 22-ton eight-wheeler with a 14.5-ton payload that would become a fixture of British heavy haulage for the next 3 decades. In 1933, Leyland's own compression-ignition diesel engine entered production. Scottish Motor Traction ordered 250, then another 100. The petrol era for civilian Leylands was effectively over. By 1938, Leyland had opened a 3.5-acre engine shop at Farrington. The village had become a single industry town. The pubs, the cooperative, the Leyland and Farrington Club, the Hippodrome Cinema, St Ambrose's and St Andrew's churches, all of them turned on the Leyland shift patterns. Whole streets were populated by men called Leylanders, 3 generations from the same family clocking on at the same gates. And war was coming again. Chapter 3. The factory that built the tanks. A new shadow factory was finished at Farrington just as hostilities began in 1939, intended to build tanks. The Luftwaffe, evidently aware, bombed it repeatedly in the early years of the war. Henry Spurrier II died in 1942. His son Aylmer Augustus Liardet was briefly managing director, but the operational reins passed to Henry Spurrier III, who was appointed general manager of a tank production group spanning 14 engineering firms. What Leyland produced between 1939 and 1945 is staggering in its breadth. 11,000 employees across Leyland, Farrington, Chorley and South Works turned out 9,000 wheeled vehicles. The militarised Hippo Mark I, the Hippo Mark II, designed in 1943 specifically for D-Day. Roughly 1,000 in service by VE Day, and 6,500 retrievers. They built 3,000 tanks: Matilda, Covenanter, Churchill, Cromwell, then Centaur and Comet. They produced 10,000 tank engines and substantial munitions output besides. But the single most important contribution may have been the one that carried another company's name. In 1940, Henry III and W.A. Robotham of Rolls-Royce agreed that the Nuffield Liberty L12 tank engine was unreliable and underpowered. Robotham, with 3 of Leyland's best designers seconded to the Rolls-Royce team, developed the Meteor, a derated version of the Merlin Aero engine. The Meteor would power the Centurion, Britain's defining post-war main battle tank. The engine that won the Cold War's first armoured standoff was born from a Leyland Rolls-Royce handshake. With the Korean War came the Spurrier Works, a vast new tank production plant funded by the Ministry of Supply and opened on the 23rd of October 1953. On the 9th of July 1956, with the war scare passing, Leyland Motors purchased it outright and renamed it in honour of Henry II. It became the largest tank-producing plant in Europe. The wide approach road into the works was named Centurion Way, after the tank, and it survives to this day as the spine of modern Leyland's industrial estate. By the mid-1950s, Henry Spurrier III had built a triumvirate that ran the company with a precision his father would have admired. Sir Henry, knighted in 1955 for industrial achievement, sat in overall charge as chairman from 1957. Stanley Markland ran the foundries and production. Donald Stokes ran sales and exports. And the most striking thing about the Spurrier era was what wasn't happening. In 3 decades of his control, Leyland Motors reputedly never lost a single day's production to industrial action. Henry III had introduced works and management joint meetings, a prefiguring of post-war participation schemes, and the shop floor, by all accounts, gave him something close to loyalty. It wouldn't last. But for now, the company was building the finest commercial vehicles in Britain. Chapter 4. The Empire on Wheels. The Comet appeared in December 1947, a new mid-weight truck, originally designed for export but a runaway domestic seller. The Beaver followed as the post-war 12-ton tractor. The Octopus was rebooted in 1948 with an all-steel cab and remained a fixture of British heavy haulage until the 32-ton weight limit changes of 1964. The Atlantean, from 1956, was a rear-engine double-decker exported worldwide. These weren't just vehicles. They were the fabric of British road transport. Anyone arriving at Leyland's Hough Lane gates between 1948 and 1968 entered a world built entirely around the making of lorries. The smell hit you first: cutting fluid, foundry sand, coke and diesel, layered so thickly that old hands claimed you could taste it on your tongue by mid-morning. Then the sound: pneumatic riveters, drop hammers, the distant howl of Atlantean buses on test runs, and underneath it all, the wartime power station turbines still humming through the 1950s and into the 1960s, a low vibration you felt through the soles of your boots before you heard it with your ears. The site was industrial Britain at full stretch. Rows of Beavers and Octopuses leaving the lines for export crates marked Lagos, Sydney, Cairo, Karachi. The original 1930s inspection building with its traditional northern light roof, designed to flood the quality bays with even, shadow-free daylight, still standing today as the British Commercial Vehicle Museum. Engine blocks on overhead conveyors, moving at the steady pace of men who'd been doing this work for 20 years and would do it for 20 more. A young apprentice starting in the late 1950s would be assigned to a section and expected to learn from the man beside him. The skills were transferable across departments. If you could read a micrometer and work a lathe in the engine shop, you could be moved to the axle line when demand shifted. But the pride was specific. The men who built the Octopus knew they were building the heaviest production lorry in Britain, and they carried that knowledge the way a shipyard riveter carried the tonnage of the vessel he'd helped launch. And then there were the calendars. The Leyland ladies, annual photographic prints of glamorous models, issued from 1935 onward, framed and hung in haulage offices, transport cafes, and workshop walls across the country. Copies still hang in the British Commercial Vehicle Museum today. They were marketing, obviously, but they were also a signature. A company confident enough in its name to put a beautiful woman beside a lorry and let both of them sell the other. The acquisition spree that followed was Henry III's way of ensuring Leyland would never be outflanked. Albion Motors of Glasgow came aboard in 1951. Scammell Lorries of Watford, military and specialist heavy haulage, in 1955. That same year, Ashok Motors of Madras began assembling Comets under license, planting the seed of what would become Ashok Leyland, one of the largest truck makers in Asia. Standard Triumph International arrived in 1961. Cars again, after a 33-year gap. Associated Commercial Vehicles followed in 1962, bringing Eck, Thornycroft, Park Royal Vehicles, and Charles H. Rowe under the Leyland umbrella. The Leyland Motor Corporation was formed in 1963, with Sir Henry as its first chairman. Rover and its subsidiary Alvis came in 1966. Aveling Barford in 1967. By the mid-1960s, Leyland dominated the British commercial vehicle market. Eck was now in-house. Irf, Foden, Atkinson and Seddon were specialist independents in the northwest, formidable but smaller. The threat from the continent, Volvo, Scania, Mercedes-Benz MAN and DAF, was still a faint cloud on the horizon. Chapter 5. The town that Leyland built. At its 1960s peak, The combined workforce at Leyland Motors Spurrier and Farrington Works, plus Batur at Farrington and Leyland Paints, ran somewhere between 30,000 and 40,000 people across the Leyland-Farrington-Chorley triangle. That number deserves a moment's thought. A triangle of Lancashire villages, none of them cities, none of them on any tourist's map, employing the population of a small English town in a single industrial complex. The Leyland and Farrington Club. The Cricket Club. Fox Lane Sports and Social Club. St Ambrose's Social Hall. The Leyland Festival. The Leyland Band. The brass band that played at company events and survived long enough to relocate to Farrington Business Park, where it plays still. All were either Leyland founded or Leyland financed. The streets carried the family marks: Spurrier Avenue, Sumner Close. The pubs filled at shift change. The cooperative knew when payday was because the queue told them. Many families had 3 generations on the books. Grandfathers who'd built RAF types for the Western Front, fathers who'd assembled Churchill tanks for D-Day, sons who were now fitting diesel engines to beavers bound for Lagos. The works hooter didn't just mark the start of a shift, it marked the rhythm of the town's entire day. When it sounded, wives knew when to put the tea on. Shopkeepers knew when the streets would fill. The village moved to Leyland time. Lancaster House, the new headquarters office block opposite Spurrier Works, was built in 1965-66 to house the swelling administrative staff of the Leyland Motor Corporation. It was the physical embodiment of confidence, a modern block rising beside the tank factory, looking out across works that stretched to the horizon. The car park held thousands of vehicles. The canteen served thousands of meals. The post room handled correspondence with dealers in 50 countries. And then there was the museum piece that nobody knew was a museum piece yet. The 1930s inspection building on King Street, with its northern light roof, where finished vehicles had once been checked before dispatch. Decades later it would house the British Commercial Vehicle Museum, displaying 60-plus vehicles including the Papamobile built for John Paul II's 1982 visit. But in the 1960s it was simply part of a living, breathing, deafeningly loud industrial operation that produced more commercial vehicles than any other site in Britain. Leyland exported everywhere. Comets and octopuses went to Africa, the Middle East, Australia, the Indian subcontinent. The company's reputation in the developing world was built on the same quality that had won the silver medal at Manchester in 1897. Machines that worked, that lasted, that could be repaired by local hands with local tools. The name Leyland in Lagos or Karachi or Sydney carried the same weight that Rolls-Royce carried for aero engines. It meant British. It meant dependable. It meant built to last. Chapter 6. The Summit Before the Fall. Sir Henry Spurrier III had a brain tumour. He'd known since 1962. The man who'd survived typhoid and dysentery in Mesopotamia, who'd lived most of his adult life on scrambled eggs, who'd built Leyland Motors into one of the 5 largest commercial vehicle makers on Earth. He was dying. He retired in June 1963, formally relinquishing the chairmanship of the corporation he'd helped create. He was elected the company's first president, an honorary title, a way of keeping the name on the letterhead while the power passed to Donald Stokes. And on the 17th of June 1964, one day after his 66th birthday, Henry Spurrier III died at his house, outside Leyland. Commercial Motors' obituary stated it bluntly. The Leyland Motor Corporation was Henry Spurrier. It was true in ways that would only become clear in the years that followed. Under Spurrier, the truck division had been the profitable core of the business. The part that worked, the part that exported, the part that never lost a day to strikes. The acquisitions had been strategic. Each one added capability or eliminated a competitor. The workforce was loyal because the management had earned it. The Spurrier settlement, those joint works and management meetings, had produced 3 decades of industrial peace in a Lancashire industry not generally known for it. Donald Stokes inherited a company that looked, from the outside, like the most successful commercial vehicle operation in Britain. 11,000 employees at the Leyland Works alone, 5 Lancashire factories plus Kingston upon Thames, Bathgate and Glasgow. The zoo of vehicles, lions, tigers, octopuses, beavers, comets, rolling off the lines. Military contracts. Export markets across the globe. A newly built headquarters. A brass band. A cricket club. A town that moved to the rhythm of the works hooter. But Stokes also inherited something else. A government that was watching. Harold Wilson's Labour administration, through Tony Benn at the Industrial Reorganisation Corporation, had decided that British industry needed rationalisation. The car industry especially. And Leyland, profitable, well-managed, export-oriented Leyland, looked like the perfect partner to rescue the ailing British motor holdings, makers of Austin, Morris, MG, and the Mini. The idea was presented as logic. Combine BMH's volume car capacity with Leyland's profitability and management discipline. Create a national champion to rival Ford, Volkswagen, and Renault. The publicly stated reasoning was impeccable. The privately understood reality was that BMH was hemorrhaging money, had no mass-market car in the development pipeline, and needed Leyland's cash flow to survive. Sir Henry Spurrier would never have agreed to it. He'd spent his entire career keeping the truck business insulated from the chaos of British car manufacturing. But Sir Henry was dead. And Donald Stokes, brilliant exporter, charismatic figure, an optimist by temperament, said yes. On the 17th of January 1968, the British Leyland Motor Corporation was formed. It was the summit, and from here, the only direction was down. Chapter 7. The merger that devoured itself. The British Leyland Motor Corporation inherited nearly 100 different companies and around 40 manufacturing plants. Sir Donald Stokes, formerly Leyland's sales director, then chairman of the Leyland Motor Corporation, now chairman of Blimk, discovered within weeks what Spurrier would have warned him about had he lived. British Motor Holdings had no mass-market car in the development pipeline. The Mini was unprofitable. The Austin Morris 1100 was aging. The Maxi and Austin 3 Litre were misjudged niche products. And the workforce in the Midlands car factories operated under a system of industrial relations that bore no resemblance to the Spurrier settlement. Leyland's fat profits and its truck division were, from January 1968 onward, effectively annexed to underwrite the cars business. Investment that should have gone into new heavy truck development was diverted south. The fixed-cylinder head Leyland 500 series truck engine of 1968, meant to be the new Leyland heavy diesel, proved a chronic gasket blower. The Ake V8 was a flop. Leyland Trucks increasingly had to buy in Cummins and Rolls-Royce engines to stay competitive, because their own parent company wouldn't fund the development of a reliable replacement. Then came the strike that broke the Spurrier covenant. In the summer of 1969, 5 Leyland truck and bus plants were strike-bound for 5 weeks. The cause was pay parity. Leyland workers in Lancashire earned less than the Midlands car workers they'd just been merged with. The injustice was real. The damage was permanent. The no-days production lost record, 3 decades of Sir Henry's patient industrial diplomacy, was over for good. Standard Triumph's Speak plant on Merseyside was hit by an 11-week strike that autumn for the same reason. The merger hadn't just absorbed Leyland into a failing car company. It had imported industrial militancy into a workforce that hadn't known it. Stokes himself would later describe the experience in terms that mixed loyalty with bewilderment. One cabinet memo, quoted years afterward, put it less gently. Lord Stokes is clearly devoted to the company, but no longer commands full confidence in his ability to lead it into recovery. His own line, recorded much later, it was like watching your house fall down after you'd just finished building it. The truck division's answer to the continent was the Marathon, launched in 1973. Cash-starved designers were told to use existing in-house parts. The ergomatic cab heavily reworked. The EK AV760 bored out and turbocharged, with Cummins L10 and 14-litre options. Performance was acceptable. Ergonomics were poor. Cab roll. Weak heating. Ventilation problems. The Volvo F88 and Scania 110 were taking significant market share from Leyland for the first time, and the marathon couldn't stop them. By 1979, it was done. In December 1974, Blue MC stood on the brink of outright bankruptcy. Stokes asked Tony Benn for a state guarantee. Sir Don Ryder was tasked with investigating. His report, published in April 1975, recommended drastic restructuring into 4 divisions, effective nationalisation through a new holding company, British Leyland Limited, with the government as principal shareholder, and, critically, no plant closures. Every factory would survive. Every problem would be managed. Sir Michael Edwards, the tough South African industrialist appointed chairman in November 1977, later called it, contemptuously, the unachievable Ryder Report. His own diagnosis was blunter. The Ryder plan's insistence on lumping everything under the Leyland name was killing the upmarket marks, and the shop stewards movement was paralysing production. Edwards ordered 25,000 redundancies in his first months, abolished the Ryder participation committees, and confronted the Biltuck head-on, sacking convener Derek Robinson at Longbridge in 1979. For the truck division specifically, Edwards split Leyland vehicles into Leyland Trucks and Leyland Bus, placed both under the BL Commercial Vehicles umbrella under Managing Director David Abel, and approved a new £33 million Leyland assembly plant on the outskirts of the town. It opened in September 1979, the first vehicle off the line a Leyland Leopard bus chassis. This was the plant that survives today. The T45 road train range followed in 1980, Leyland's last great in-house heavy truck programme. The C40 cab, designed jointly with Bars and Ogle Design, was sleek and modern. The Roadrunner, the Freighter, the Constructor, the Road Train, the Cruiser, a complete family from 7.5-ton non-HGEV to heavy fleet tractor. The Cummins L10 as standard fit. It was a good range. The trade press praised it. The export markets took notice. But Edwards himself privately predicted that only Land Rover and Jaguar had a long-term future inside BL. The British truck market was shrinking. Export markets like oil-rich Nigeria collapsed with the 1986 oil price slump. Bedford's heavy truck plant closed that same year. Leyland Trucks were by 1986 building only about 10,000 trucks per annum, and their own 98 series engine line was in steady decline. The truck division that had once been the profitable core, the part that worked when everything else was falling apart, was now a candidate for disposal, and Margaret Thatcher's government wanted it gone. Chapter 8. The Dutch Marriage. BL plc was renamed the Rover Group in 1986. Graham Day, a Canadian shipbuilder Thatcher had installed to run the business, was given a clear directive: privatise everything that wasn't a car. The truck division, loss-making, underinvested, but with a new factory, a competent product range and a robust UK dealer network, needed a buyer. The first candidate was General Motors. Its Bedford heavy truck operation had just closed. A UK Bedford Leyland combine had industrial logic and Ministry of Defence appeal. The deal was killed inside Whitehall. Ministers didn't want Britain's most storied truck name passing into American ownership. The second candidate was PACCAR Incorporated of Bellevue, Washington, already owner of Foden in Sandbach, Cheshire. Talks failed because the government insisted on bundling in the Freight Rover van operation at Washwood Heath, Birmingham. PACCAR didn't want vans. The deal collapsed. Enter DAF. DAF, Van Doorn's Aanhangwagen Fabriek, had been founded in 1928 in Eindhoven by Hub Van Doorn. It was the smallest of the European truck majors. Its 1985 production ran at 14,382 units against Leyland's 10,000. Its largest engine, the 11.6-litre 95 series turbo diesel, was famously based on the old Leyland 0680 unit. DAF had taken a licence in the 1960s. The Dutch government held around 25% of the company through DAF Beheer. The Van Doorn family held around 42%. DAF needed scale and a UK distribution network. Leyland needed a partner. The deal closed in spring 1987. A new holding company, DAF NV, was formed. Ownership split 60-40. DAF Beheer to Rover Group. 3 plants, Eindhoven for heavy trucks, Leyland for medium and right-hand drive, Washwood Heath for vans. The Albion Axle plant in Glasgow included. Chorley parts included. The Leyland Technical Centre included. Promises were made. £150 million of UK investment over 5 years. Leyland would be the group's lighter truck centre. Ministry of Defence contracts would be honoured. Commercial motor covered it all under a general wave of euphoria. The boom-time 1980s hadn't cracked yet. It looked like a rescue. But the structure told a different story. DAF, half Leyland's size by physical capacity, but with a stronger balance sheet, got management control. Art van der Pat, DAF's chairman, presided over the management board. George Simpson, from Leyland Trucks, became UK chief executive but reported to Eindhoven. Graham Day and Rover Group finance director David Hankinson sat on the supervisory board to represent the British 40%. Commercial Motors' verdict, delivered in a 2012 retrospective, it was said it was more of a merger than a takeover. Yet it was DAF which had the whip hand, and it was very much a reverse takeover. And embedded in the merger contracts, revealed only after the bankruptcy, was a clause that would doom Leyland. It specified that should the group ever require state rescue, the Dutch and Belgian government's backstop would be available only to the Netherlands and Belgium-based operations. The British activities had no equivalent guarantee from Westminster. The contracts had been drawn up to ensure that, should anything go wrong, the Dutch government would shore up its own side of the business and leave the British side to fend for itself. Nobody in Leyland appears to have noticed. Or if they did, nobody raised the alarm. In June 1989, DAF NV was floated on the Amsterdam and London stock exchanges. The shares were oversubscribed several times. DAF Beheer reduced to around 22%. Rover Group, now owned by British Aerospace, reduced to around 16%, then effectively cashed out. The remaining 60+% floated. The British government had its arm's-length truck disposal complete. British Aerospace had the cash. The Leyland workers had a Dutch boss and a contract they'd never read. The initial years looked like vindication. Production at Leyland rose steadily. The new 45 Series 7.5-tonner became a runaway success. By 1989, DAF NV was building 14,000 trucks at Leyland alone. The UK truck market reached 70,000 units, the post-war high. Leyland DAF was profitable. But the structural problems were real. From 16 tons gross weight upward, DAF and Leyland offered competing models at almost every weight category. The 80 Series, launched in 1990 to try to rationalise the overlap, used the Leyland Roadtrain T45 cab on a DAF chassis with the DAF 330 ATI engine, itself a turbocharged descendant of the Leyland 0680. The irony was perfect. The engine that powered the combined company's flagship had begun its life in the company it had absorbed. The 95 Series, launched in cooperation with Spain's Enasa through the Cabtech joint venture, won International Truck of the Year. But it was a Dutch product, designed in Eindhoven. Leyland's heavy truck line was being quietly retired. Scammell of Watford, the Royal Navy's military specialist maker since 1922, was the first to go, closed in 1988. Its production was consolidated at Leyland. Then, during 1991, DAF NV explored a strategic alliance with Mercedes-Benz to share technology and rationalise costs. The talks collapsed. The company's debt stood at approximately £1 billion. And then the market fell off a cliff. The UK heavy truck market dropped from 70,000 units in 1989 to 31,000 in 1991. A 56% collapse, the deepest peacetime contraction since the war. The continental markets followed in 1992. DAF NV, reliant on the UK as its single largest market, was gutted. Emergency loans came from a Dutch state-backed investment company. John Gilchrist, an Edinburgh-born engineer with over 30 years Leyland Group service, was asked to move from Leyland to Eindhoven to oversee group manufacturing, applying lean production techniques learned from Japanese partners. Capacity was cut. 3,500 jobs were shed across the group. It was not enough. Chapter 9. The day the receivers walked in. Through January 1993, DAF NV negotiated a refinancing package with its consortium of UK, Dutch, and Belgian banks, among them Barclays, NatWest, ABN AMRO, Generali Bank. The Dutch and Belgian governments offered to underwrite their share of new credit lines. The deal was close, weeks from completion. Then a worker at the Leyland DAF van plant at Washwood Heath, Birmingham, rang the BBC. The story was simple and devastating. Workers had been stood down because brake and hydraulic components had run out. Supplier Automotive Products had placed the firm on stop. BBC News broke it. Within hours, other Leyland DAF plants were reporting sporadic parts shortages. Suppliers, fearing they wouldn't be paid, withdrew deliveries. The financial restructuring, which had been weeks from completion, collapsed in a cascade of panic. At 1:30 on Tuesday, the 2nd of February 1993, Leyland DAF Limited was placed into voluntary receivership. John Talbot and Murdoch MacKillop of Arthur Anderson were appointed joint administrative receivers. In The Hague, DAF NV filed for a surseance van betaling, a legal moratorium on its debts. DAF NV was formally declared bankrupt on the 26th of February. Within hours, Michael Heseltine, president of the Board of Trade, was at the dispatch box answering an urgent private notice question. His words, recorded in Hansard, the government have been disappointed to hear about the financial problems facing the Dutch-based company DAF NV, which today filed for a legal moratorium on its debts. We have not participated directly in the discussions on the financial restructuring, as that primarily related to the company's Dutch and Belgian activities. Robin Cook, for the opposition, was scathing. Why did he not intervene to stop that major British company going into receivership? Why is it that the Belgian and Dutch governments were willing to underwrite the loans that would secure the company's future, but not the British government? The Birmingham Labour MP for Washwood Heath rose. 2,000 people worked at that factory in his constituency. A Glasgow MP raised 500 jobs at the Albion Axle plant. A Lancashire MP raised 2,500 in the Preston Leyland Chorley area. Heseltine's reply, each time, circled back to the same formula: the Hon. Gentlemen cannot have listened to what I said about the Dutch and Belgian governments. Translation: London would not act. The morning shift on the 3rd of February arrived at the Hough Lane gates to find the security posts carrying receivers' notices. Around 5,000 employees across Leyland Trucks, Multipart at Chorley, Albion Automotive in Glasgow, and the Leyland Technical Centre. Some 2,500 of them in the Preston Leyland Chorley triangle alone. Another 2,000 at Leyland DAF vans. Washwood Heath. The conveyor stopped with trucks half built. Parts sat in stillages. The paint shop was still warm. Within the first weeks, 450 Leyland workers were made redundant. Total UK redundancies across the group would reach roughly 1,600. The broader employment shock, including supplier chain losses across Lancashire, ran to several thousand. The Transport and General Workers Union and the AU Mobilist. A joint workforce meeting was held at the plant. Union leaders demanded parity with the Dutch and Belgian government interventions. Protest delegations travelled to Westminster. Teguh national officers briefed MPs. But there was no general strike. The workers knew the company had ceased trading. The priority became saving the plant rather than fighting the closure. And within a month, the betrayal was made concrete. The Dutch and Belgian governments backstopped the management buy-out of the Eindhoven, Westerlo and Oval operations. DAF Trucks NV was reborn under predominantly state ownership, the Dutch government holding around 39% of the new equity, heavily supported by the state bank Nationale Investeringsbank. Within 3 years, its profits were restored. Identical financial circumstances. 2 governments. One acted, the other did not. Commercial Motors' 2011 verdict was the one the industry remembered. Heseltine's notoriety in the British transport industry comes from his refusal to step in and save the biggest name in British truck manufacturing. British truck manufacturing fell into the hands of the Dutch and Americans as a result of his actions. Wives and partners met at the Leyland and Farrington Club. Older workers remembered the 1969 strike, the 1977 layoffs, the Long Edwards shadow. The phrase that recurred, in different voices, at different tables, was always some variation of the same disbelief. I never thought it would come to this. Chapter 10. The Hard Road Back. Murdoch MacKillop's strategy at Arthur Andersen was straightforward. Break the group up to maximise creditor recovery. The most valuable single asset, he calculated, was not the Leyland factory itself but the multi-part parts operation at Chorley, provided he could tie it to long-term supply contracts with whatever new manufacturing entities emerged. Arthur Andersen would show no favoritism to any one buyout team. They would have to compete. John Gilchrist was back at Leyland by mid-February, recalled from Eindhoven. Edinburgh-born, a hard-smoking engineer with over 30 years' service in Leyland Group operations, he had in fact proposed a Leyland Trucks management buyout as early as 1986, when BL first considered selling the truck division. He'd been rebuffed. Now, within days of the receivership, he raised it again with a small group of plant directors. The core team came together quickly. Gilchrist, as joint managing director, leading the buyout. Stuart Pearce, Leyland DAF's UK personnel director. John Oliver, managing director of the Leyland assembly plant. Their advisors at Coopers and Lie Brand were led by Jonathan Wackett, who warned them at the first meeting about the hell we would go through, and how many buyouts led to divorces. The team's reply, recorded later by Pearce: "We're manufacturers. We've been through hard times." Gilchrist's strategic decision was counterintuitive, and it was made within the first week. He would not try to rebuild Leyland as a standalone, all-singing, all-dancing pan-European truck maker. His reasoning was brutally simple. There was no place for an eighth truck maker in Europe. Leyland would be a specialist contract assembler, building lighter trucks for the new DAF, honouring Ministry of Defence orders, and targeting right-hand drive export markets. The ambition was modest. The logic was survival. They needed approximately £27 million. The backers were NatWest, Barclays and 3i. The key precondition was a long-term supply agreement with the reborn DAF Trucks NV in Eindhoven, by which DAF would buy roughly 3/4 of Leyland's output for sale through the European DAF dealer network. The 700 surviving employees agreed to a pay freeze running to the start of 1995. A rival bid came from former Leyland Trucks director Ian McKinnon, whose plan was to take Leyland plus Multipart plus the Albion Axle plant in Glasgow. The receiver accepted Gilchrist's bid, partly because Gilchrist had retained the support of the workforce and of the Ministry of Defence as customer. 4 management buyouts emerged from the wreckage. DAF Trucks NV in Eindhoven, backed by the Dutch and Flemish governments. Leyland Trucks Limited. Gilchrist's team. LDV Group at Washwood Heath, led by plant director Alan Amy, backed by 3i. Albion Automotive in Glasgow, later sold to American Axle. Multipart Solutions at Chorley, later acquired by TV's Supply Chain Solutions. The Leyland Technical Centre emerged as a separate buyout in July 1994. On the 11th of June 1993, John Gilchrist addressed the surviving 650 workers at the Leyland assembly plant. The deal was done. The NatWest banker who rose to explain the financing terms was met with a standing ovation, stamping, cheering workers waving cans of McEwan's lager. David Bowen of The Independent, covering the story, captured the banker's bewilderment. "I had this speech to read. They wouldn't stop." After 4 months of desperate uncertainty, during which 450 colleagues had been let go, the remaining jobs were safe. The pay freeze was voted through. Leyland Trucks Limited was born. The trading name a deliberate decision to keep the heritage Leyland name on the company's books, even though the trucks rolling off the line would carry DAF badges for the European market. The phrase that became a kind of post-1993 shop floor identity wasn't grand or defiant. It was what Pearce had told Coopers and Lie Brand at that first meeting, and it stuck. We're manufacturers. We've been through hard times. Chapter 11. What the Silence Keeps. On the 7th of October 1996, PACCAR Incorporated of Bellevue, Washington, announced the acquisition of DAF Trucks NV from the Dutch government and its co-shareholders for $543 million. On the 11th of May 1998, PACCAR completed its purchase of Leyland Trucks Limited, 5 years to the month after the management buyout. John Gilchrist announced his retirement. The company he'd saved from the receivers was now owned by a Seattle-based family firm that had been profitable every year since 1938. The Leyland DAF badge was dropped from 2000. Trucks rolling off the Lancashire line now carry only the DAF logo. Foden production transferred to Leyland that same year. The Foden brand was retired for good in 2006. The Leyland marque survives only on the company letterhead, on the sign at the factory gate, and in the name of Ashok Leyland, sold to the Hinduja Group in 1987, now one of the largest truck manufacturers in Asia. The plant itself is the quiet resurrection. 86 acres at Farrington. Around 1,000 employees. Production capacity up to 12 trucks per hour. A record output of 24,700 trucks in 2008, supporting a DAF UK market share of 27.3%. More than a third of output exported to over 50 countries. All right-hand drive DAF ELF, CF and XF models for UK and Commonwealth markets are designed, developed and assembled here. In 2019, the plant received the Queen's Award for Enterprise in International Trade. In 2024, PACCAR's group recorded 204,200 vehicles worldwide, its 85th consecutive year of net profit. The contrast with the rest of the old British Leyland Empire is jagged. Cowley has shrunk. Longbridge has gone. LDV at Washwood Heath fell into liquidation in 2009. Foden disappeared. Scammell disappeared. But Leyland Trucks has been profitable continuously since 1998. Saved, in the end, by an American multinational doing what the British state would not. Walk through Leyland now, and the marks of the empire are still legible if you know where to look. Centurion Way runs through the modern industrial estate, named for the tank. Spurrier Avenue and Sumner Close carry the founders' names. Lancaster House, the 1960s headquarters, still stands opposite where the Spurrier Works once turned out armour. The British Commercial Vehicle Museum sits in the old 1930s inspection building on King Street, its northern light roof flooding the exhibition halls with the same shadow-free daylight that once illuminated quality inspectors checking octopuses before dispatch. John Gilchrist himself chaired the museum's trustees for decades and personally led the Heritage Lottery Fund bid to refurbish it. 60-plus vehicles inside. The Pope Mobile. The Leyland Ladies' Portraits by Walter Lambert. Lord Stokes's portrait on the wall. The Leyland Historical Society runs the Industrial Heritage of Leyland and Farrington Oral History Project. Over 200 ex-workers' testimonies recorded. A temporary heritage centre in 2018 attracted 1,600 visitors in 7 weeks. The Leyland Band plays on at Farrington Business Park. But the older works are gone. North Works, largely demolished. South Works, partially demolished. The museum building the sole survivor. Farrington Works, some buildings absorbed into the modern plant. The rest cleared. The bitter rubber factory at Farrington was demolished in 2004. A Tesco superstore, a Morrison's, a Homebase, and an Argos stand where rubber was mixed and moulded for the best part of a century. Spurrier Works, largely cleared. The town that once employed 40,000 people across its triangle of factories now has a single assembly plant and 1,000 workers. The tragedy of Leyland Trucks is not, in the end, the tragedy of British Leyland. The cars division wrote its own epitaph through poor product, poor management, and chronic strikes. The truck division was the part that worked, the part that even in BL's blackest years turned out the T45 family, won the British Army's drops contract, and ran a modern assembly plant. What killed Leyland Trucks as an independent name was two political decisions taken in two capitals across 6 years. The first, Thatcher's, executed by Graham Day in 1987, was to dispose of the truck division at virtually any cost as part of a broader privatisation drive, accepting a Dutch reverse takeover with a hidden clause that excluded the British plants from any future state rescue. The second, Heseltine's, on the 2nd of February 1993, was to accept that logic to its grim conclusion, while two other governments acted. The redemption came not from London, but from a small group of plant managers led by an Edinburgh engineer with a chain-smoking habit, an offer of help from Coopers and Lybrand, and a workforce that voted to freeze its own pay. It came again from an American family business in Seattle that bought the company and invested in it for 27 years. But the redemption is in a different key than the original. The trucks rolling off the line at Farrington today are DAF LFs and CFs and XFs, designed in Eindhoven, badged Dutch, sold through the DAF dealer network. The Lion, the Tiger, the Octopus, the Beaver, the Comet, the Marathon, the Road Train, all gone. The largest truck builder in Britain is, in product terms, an outpost of the Dutch industry that took it over in 1987 and walked away from it in 1993. 1,000 people still clock in at Farrington every morning. The shift patterns still shape the day. Somewhere inside, an apprentice who started in 1993, the year the receivers walked in, is still building trucks, 3 decades on. The name on the gate still says Leyland. The name on the lorry does not.